All right, we're talking today with Greg Norman, the head coach at Ann Arbor Skyline, and a class of 2019 Michigan High School Lacrosse Coaches Association Hall of Fame member. Greg, thank you for taking this time, and thank you for all the work that you've done in all of the interviews. Today's kind of a flip, and you're going to be the interviewee instead of the interviewer. And so we're thrilled to be able to have this opportunity to speak to you. And let's start today the way that you've started nearly all of the conversations that you had. Where did it begin for you? It's lacrosse enter into your life.
Before I get into the specifics, let me thank you. It's been an interesting discussion as to how you're doing all the interviews, and all of a sudden you thought of 100 ways to interview yourself. It doesn't necessarily work. And so being able to have this conversation with somebody that I have great respect for is much appreciated. For me, it started as a box player, and I say this from this standpoint. I grew up playing hockey, grew up playing a lot of sports, but grew up playing hockey. And in the summertime, you were kind of stuck playing to keep the rink open and keep some of those kinds of processes working. So you just kind of stayed in shape by playing a little bit of a box. I didn't play very long, and I wasn't very good. So we did that as Bantams and as junior Bs and junior A players, as hockey players. But for the most part, my lacrosse introduction was very limited from a field perspective, and I've got a story on how the field all worked out. But from there, went to Fenton High School. I was a parochial school kid in Detroit, and actually in Livonia. And then my 9th grade year, my dad decided to move the family out to the cottage, out in this case, out to the house out in Fenton, out on White Lake Road in 23, which is not too far from where you are there in Brighton. And grew up on Runyon Lake, and the cool part of that was we had a ski hill at the top, and they called Kandahar. It was a private ski area, and we had a Tyrone Hills, a golf course, and we lived on the lake. So you had a chance to, participate in a lot of things. The cool part about moving to Fenton was I was scheduled to go to Brother Rice out of St. Bernardine's in Livonia. I was a parochial kid, K through 8, and by going to Rice, I was going to probably only do a few things. When going to a small town like Fenton, you got a chance to be in the band and be the editor of the school paper and play different sports and be involved in a small community. And growing up in that atmosphere was really cool. And I was very fortunate to have coaches in the early days that I was kept on the basketball team as a sophomore and as a junior because the coach liked me. I was the worst basketball player in the history of Fenton High School, without a doubt. But I would sit in the front of the bus with the coach, and we would talk offense, and we would talk all these kinds of things, and he would take the time to explain it. And he said, at some point, you're going to be a coach. And I went, well, I don't know if that's true. I wanted to be a journalist. While I was in high school, I was fortunate enough to get a job at the local newspaper. So I worked from the time I was 14 till I was 18, working at the Fenton Independent as a sports editor and writing a full-time deal. Still played sports. So a great place to grow up and a great opportunity to go before I left and then went away from there. Played football.
When did that paper fold?
Never did. It was bought out by Flint area newspapers, and then eventually it became part of the then Century 21, not Century 21, Century 21st newspapers. Bought the Oakland Press, bought a bunch of papers. But it was a typical small town newspaper in that it wasn't a rag sheet. And Bob Silbar, the guy who owned it, had actually been the editor of the Detroit Times, which was the third paper in Detroit in the 40s and 50s after the war. And he was an alcoholic, retired, bought a small town paper and treated it like it was a large town paper. But my senior year, of the folks that worked at both the high school newspaper and worked for him, 4 of us got journalism degrees in college, and all of us worked at major newspapers, the Arizona Republic, New York Times. We were just very fortunate to be in a place to learn our profession. And when you have that kind of opportunity to be invested in or be injected in an early age, just a great opportunity from a professional standpoint. And at 18, I get introduced to Joe Falls, an old Detroit sports writer, who was then the page 3 editor for Sporting News, which for perspective, it would be like being on SportsCenter, because page 3 columnist for the Sporting News was the Bible guy. He ran that column for years, and I'm interning for one of the best sports writers in America. So all of a sudden you're working and covering games at went to the first game at Joe Louis Arena and those kinds of things. And then from there in high school, got a chance to start writing rock columns. There was a magazine in Birmingham called Cream, and it was basically a rag sheet. And they got 25 cents an inch. So you go down and say, oh, by the way, I'm a writer. And so you get sent out to concerts and you get a chance to do those things. So it was just a lot of things in my life have been opportunities because of the profession I'm in, not necessarily because of the talent that I have. And I say that because, I've interviewed Dennis Conner, who's one of the best sailors in the world, for another show. And I've had a conversation with a couple of big-time lacrosse coaches, because they were talking about doing some Kevin Corrigan for one. So it's the profession, and then so it's been really fun doing it from that. That was a good start for us.
That's interesting. So it's not necessarily the attraction was not necessarily sports, but your journalism career kind of took you in those directions, and you enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of it, journalists will tell you that they do it because they love the word, and they want to be able to have, the opportunity to write, which is what you start out as. You're a writer per se. I probably did it more than anything for the notoriety. You wanted to get to be known. That's part of the ego that goes with the position. And in my lifetime, I was a coach, a writer, a columnist, and a referee. 3 positions, 3 professional positions. You better have pretty thick skin, or you're not going to have, I know sometimes I'm looked at as being somewhat opinionated, but I was a columnist for 25 years of my life, where I had to have an opinion every day from a writing perspective. So God makes us all different for different reasons. And having that look, that view, that thought. But a lot of times I'll be at a party and I'll start talking, and 90% of the people at the store assume that you're just, how can you have this background and that background and this story and that story? It's not BS. It's just because of the positions and the opportunities you've had as a journalist, because you cover so many different things. And I think that's the cool part.
You grew up in the Fenton area. Where do you go from there?
Well, from Fenton, I decided to leave and go a long ways away. I was a hockey player, and I wanted to go up north. My my mom's from Champion in that area, Ishpeming, and my dad's from Marquette. So I wanted to follow. I was recruited out of college, out of high school, to play a couple different sports. And in those days, you played a variety of sports. You're not stuck in one sport. We had a ski hill up the hill called Kandahar. So you skied all day, and maybe that night you came back and you did you skated on the ice rink, because we were on the lake. So I went up to Michigan Tech, was going to go play hockey for John McGinnis. My dad had been a minor league hockey player that played a number of games in the NHL in the days when there were 6 teams, but was a career minor leaguer for the Rochester Americans, but actually played for the Marquette Sentinels. And if you remember in the old days, Calumet had a team in the NHL. There was a lot of large arenas. So anyway, I wanted to go back up to Michigan Tech, which I did. John McGinnis was a really cool coach, and I wanted to go as far away as I wanted to go. And the good part for me, talking about being stupid, I go to a technical university to take a liberal arts major, because they had nothing that wasn't other than liberal arts, being technical. Got away from home, got a little stupid, got involved. The joke was there was a bar in Houghton called the Library. So, of course, every night I would call my mom. We would have a conversation. I was at the library. End of the spring semester, after this hockey season ended, kind of was told that my grade point wouldn't have gotten me a job on the garbage scow. Flunked out of school, left, came home. I was involved in a program in high school called the Home Seminary Program, because at one point I thought I wanted to be a priest, and that's kind of the K-8 education. So I made the great decision that summer to enroll at Sacred Heart, which was a seminary for priests in Detroit. That experiment didn't last very long. Lindell AC, which is an old bar, if you remember, that was owned by Jimmy Butz and Karras, was a few streets down from where we were at the seminary. And I had gotten an ability when I was 18, because at 18, when I was 18, you could drink. So I'm now 19. We would sneak out, go to Lindell with our collars on, and kind of hustle girls and have beers and enjoy things. And come to find out that's not the kind of activity that they wanted at Sacred Heart. So by the end of the summer, maybe it was a good idea not to go to be a priest, and just wasn't sure what to do. Worked that summer as a journalist and kind of made the decision that I wanted to go where I should have gone in the first place, which was to go back to Michigan State, which is what I did. And went back having to pay all of my own tuition the first year because Dad said if you can't make it through tech, and some of the other, like every young person, I had 18 months where I had some interesting choices, and went to state. Quickly got involved with the state news and started journalism again, and got back to writing and doing different things, and tried to be a walk-on in a couple places, and walked on and had fun, but no caliber of a Big Ten athlete by any stretch of the imagination. And finished my career, got out, and kind of moved forward knowing that I wanted to coach. From a coaching perspective, when I was 18, my senior year, between my senior year in high school, they asked me to head coach the local Little League team because our neighbor had died of a heart attack. So I took over a team at the age of 18, thinking I was Bobby Knight. And the Indians, which is the team I coached, they'd never won anything, and we won the league that year. Well, the coach that wins the league also gets a chance to coach the all-star team. Well, the fact that I'd beaten 5 other teams with adult men, they all had a meeting and decided that they were going to change the rules, and my dad finally backed it up. And so we had fun. I coached the all-star team, but I guess from day one, there's always been a little bit of edge to the process. And once I coached that team, there's that moment of, wow, this is fun. So now what do? You're a writer and you're a journalist. Which one are you going to take? So you kind of move forward.
So you coached at 18, but then took a long break between that?
I coached various freshman, sophomore, junior, high, all the way through college. I coached somewhere. I coached in Fenton. I coached, assistant football coach, JV, baseball, whatever it was. Coached a variety of sports, and also got involved. We needed money, so became an official. Decided to go do basketball and football games, and did all of those things in the early days. My federation number for officiating starts with 0. If you don't know anything about officiating, and if your number starts with 0, it means you've been registered since 1970. So I'm still registered for all these years, and you got $25 a game. It was better than, doing other things. So in those days, you had a job. You worked in the shop. You did something. You worked construction. I wanted to be a skier all the time, so I got a job as a ski instructor. Didn't want to work for my father, laying carpet and doing things in the summertime. I got a job as a lifeguard. And to this day, my mom and I would have a discussion about the fact that my dad didn't understand that making $5 an hour as a lifeguard was better than working $4 an hour ripping up carpet and having to clean up housing tracks. And he just thought that it wasn't man's work to sit on a boat and, talk to girls. Well, I thought it was a smart move, but we had that discussion. I think the break for me was that the sports information director, my senior year at Michigan State, the sports information director was asked to be the Olympic public relations director and the press director. So he hired a whole bunch of guys to go work Montreal, the summer games, and do nothing more than just be liaisons between sports. I think I got licensings to like badminton and hand volleyball or team volleyball or something. But seeing the world at that level, because we'd worked the 2 weeks for the summer for free, we got our hotel, we had to get up there for free. But working in the press business at that point was like, okay, maybe press is more important than being a coach. Doesn't mean I couldn't coach, but that was a sort of the impetus to move forward from that standpoint.
What year was that?
1976. 1976, the Montreal games.
Okay.
So the next couple of years I coached and hung out and just did what we do and worked journalism. I worked for the Detroit Free Press. I got married in 1979. I'll make a very brief short. Gail Cronk from Fenton was the 1980 Winter Olympic hockey team's travel agent. In those days, you had traveling secretaries. He was a vice president of American Amateur Hockey Association. And he asked me if I'd like to get on the back of a bus, write publicity for a hockey team in July of 1979. I'd gotten married in June of 79, and I was going to be gone for 5 months. But, hey, this sounds like an adventure, and it gets me out of Michigan. If you remember in those days, you wanted to go someplace because you couldn't get it done here. I wanted to be Joe
Right.
Falls, but Joe Falls was only 50 years old at that time. So it's like, where do you go? I want to work for Sports Illustrated. I want to be
Sure.
that guy. So if I get on the back of this bus and they have these opportunities, everybody thought I was nuts, and rightfully so. I mean, $75 a week. I got my travel, but I was only making $300 a week working for the Free Press at the time as a stringer and a part-time news reporter. So for 6 months, and my hockey background is that some of the guys that made the 80 Olympic team, some of those guys came through. If you remember back to the late 70s, there was a thing called the Great Lakes Junior Hockey League. It was an experiment for the Paddock Pools and St. Clair Saints and Ted Wabi and a lot of those guys. They started a league in 76, Gale did, with the idea that in those days, great players went to Canada and played junior A and got paid. Those kids could not come back to play American hockey on a scholarship because they were getting paid in Canada. So the Great Lakes League started with the understanding that they would play. There were 6 teams in Detroit. They would play, but it was always directed towards college scholarships. In the 6 years that the league ran, they had 350 players go to Division I player schools and play. My dad was a player in what was then the American Hockey League with Gale and a guy named Bob Johnson, who was the hockey coach at the University of Wisconsin. And Bob and my dad and Gale were roommates in Green Bay back in the 50s when they'd come back from war. Well, my dad left before the Second World War and went to Michigan State as a football player, and never got to school because he went in Second World War. He came back from the war. When he was 16, he played for the Marquette Sentinels and got $25 a game because he was a very poor family. When he came back from war and enrolled in school, and Buck Nystrom is a name that you probably are familiar with. Buck was 2 years younger than my father, and then a Michigan State athlete. And one of the reasons that my dad went to Michigan State, Buck's wife was my second cousin because it was my dad's first cousin. So when the NCAA checked on my father and his eligibility, it turned out that he was ineligible because he'd gotten paid at 16. Never got the chance to go to college and become a coach, which is what he wanted to do. So years later, they started the Great Lakes League with the understanding these kids get a chance to maybe play collegiately where they wouldn't go to Canada. And if you start thinking about the names that came through that league, it was Al Iafrate, and it was Chris Chelios, and it was Mark Johnson, and it was, every name you could think of, Kenny Morrow, a gold medal in 4. Kenny's from Flint. Right. So you follow this team around, and I'm on the bus. I've been married 6 months, and then all of a sudden we end up, we go to New York, they lose. Then they start to win some games. And all of a sudden, my byline's showing up because I'm writing publicity at this point. The New York Times full-time writers came and had a conversation, and they wanted me to continue. So I ended up the last 2 weeks of that stint being sort of a secondary writer, if you will, sort of the notes, if you will. And so I covered Kenny Morrow bought, a pastry today at his particular shop. Well, it led me to know some folks, mostly Punch Sulzberger, who was then the publisher and owner of the New York Times. And when the Olympics were over, it turned out pretty well. My dad did not get my writing until in February, he saw a byline on the front page of the New York Times when he's in Florida. And all of a sudden, maybe all those choices I made prior that were stupid weren't so dumb. And it gave me the opportunity to do some things. So at that moment, what do you want to do? So the New York Times owned all the papers in Lake Placid, all of the papers north, Lake Placid, Rouse's Point, a bunch of places, Potsdam. So I became general manager working for the Times in upstate New York and got a chance to live in Lake Placid because we were there and bought a house. And now I'm a skier. I'm in the mountains. I lived at the bottom of Whiteface and thought life was great. Not so much. Didn't want to live where. So my brother-in-law lived in California, and I will take a breath here. My brother-in-law lived in California. And while I was in Lake Placid, I got involved in coaching skiing and being involved in a lot of outdoor activities, still officiating.
Officiating football and basketball primarily?
Still did that in small towns in Plattsburgh and Burlington, Vermont, and still continue to officiate. Long story short, went up to We're up in Plattsburgh. We're up in someplace. Anyway, my brother-in-law calls me in February and tells me he's in San Diego and it's 75 degrees and sends me a picture. Wow, I'm tired of being cold. In that particular winter, it was 40 below zero. And I'll tell you the quick story. We closed off everything except the house, except the front room, the kitchen, and the toilet. One day I go downstairs to go use the restroom. I am doing my business and I hear these sounds. The toilet water froze over. And I'm thinking, this is just not right. I flush the toilet, get the ice away, take care of it. But I'm thinking, I don't want to live in a house where the toilet water freezes. So within about a week, we decided we're going to move to California. And I'd made a quick decision in 79 to make this quick move exit to go to New York anyway. So we ended up in San Diego. And that's kind of where a lot of the story starts with lacrosse and everything else. So the Times owns a bunch of papers out west on the New York Times regional newspaper group. I started with a newspaper called the Press Enterprise in Riverside, and eventually ended up at the San Diego Tribune, and I was out there for about 15 or 16 years. While I was there, I got a job as a head football coach at a small academy in Temecula, California, and then coached and officiated. And about, let's see, it would have been about 1984, 85, a guy from Fallbrook asked me if I would be interested in coaching lacrosse. I said, sure. Where's the rink? Excuse me? I said, where's the rink? He said, well, we don't play rink. We play on a field. And I started laughing. I said, you don't play lacrosse on a field. You play it inside. What are you talking about? I said, so he shows me a picture in a book, and, oh, they play on a field. Passing and catching is the same. But so I helped out a little bit, not very much, and kind of just got my feet wet. They went on. I was only around for about a year. I continued to coach other sports until we decided to make a move to come home. And that's, I don't know.
Had you seen the field game in Michigan when you were in high school?
No. Wouldn't have known watermelon from a lacrosse game. No.
Okay.
Not even a little bit.
Because it must have been right around the same time that field lacrosse was starting in Michigan, that you were heading to Northern and to Michigan State. I would think that'd be around.
Well, State had a team, obviously, but it was just not something. It was just those guys with those sticks and those goofy looking shorts and those helmets. How would you play a sport that had helmets look like that? It just didn't make sense. And again, if you're a hockey player, it's box. It's you don't think about field, and there really was no correlation. There's a huge discussion now with box, but not then. And I think that's part of that discussion, is that you have to look at that as part of the from that sense. So you do what you do. So your lacrosse coaching career began in the San Diego area. How long did you coach there before you returned to Michigan? Well, I coached for about 5 or 6 months just to help junior programs in the Fallbrook and the northern San Diego County area get off the ground, because they just needed volunteers. And so I was maybe help the parents understand how to catch. There's a Will Yateman, who's a linebacker and a tight end that played at Maryland and Notre Dame. His dad is the father of sort of lacrosse in San Diego County. So our paths crossed because I had a radio spot in the morning from KFMB in San Diego called On the Spot with Greg Norman. So I did a 90-second little sporting thing that we did, and Will's wife was the sales manager for the KFMB radio station. So I would do my 90 spot in the morning, and one day she saw that I had a conversation about something related to lacrosse, and I made some point. And she said, well, what do you know about lacrosse? And I said, well, not very much. I used to hang around practice and basically drink water, and I was a backup goaltender and just stand there because I didn't really want to play in the summertime. I want to get out to the boat and the lake and everything else. So we started and helped out with their junior programs to teach the kids how to pass and catch. And, of course, you show up with the wooden stick for the first time, and the kids look like you're nuts because everything else is modern. So it was an interesting – I think I quit because I didn't know really what the hell I was doing. And I think that's part of it. And I wanted to be more than anything when I was 21, 22, I wanted to be a Division I football coach because that's where it went. But the journalism career was working, and I was fortunate enough to be in Los Angeles for the 84 Olympics. I was fortunate enough to be in Lake Placid for the 80 Olympics. And then obviously 76 Montreal. So I'd earned some status in the journalism world, and I was continually writing various discussions. I covered biking. I got a chance to still cover music. So I loved writing, and that was kind of where it stayed. And avocation was the rest of coaching.
Sure. So how do you get from San Diego back to Michigan?
So my wife gets pregnant, and we decided California's not a place to grow children up in because of just the changing climate and contents. And just, I was then 35. So let's move home. And we kind of took a detour through Florida, wanted to move where it was warm because I didn't want to go back to cold again. Went to Florida for about a year. New York Times sent me to the Naples Daily News. And then they were fortunate enough to get me back home. And so a year later, so this would have been 96 or 7, and we ended up coming back. I went to work for the Oakland Press. Oakland Press was owned partially by a company that had the New York Times before the 21st century bought them out. So I went to work as the production director for the Oakland Press and just kind of settled in. When I got home, I got a phone call from Tom Rashid. And I remember Tom from some old days of being in Michigan, as being around sports and around journalism. Tom was at that point, was the longtime director of athletics for the Catholic League, and told me that, I'm trying to think of Fusco's first name, the athletic director at Chippewa Valley, had just gotten his first job at Bishop Borges. Did I want to coach baseball? So I went down to Bishop Borges, talked to, what is Fusco's first name? He's anyway, I don't remember. He was at Borges. This is when Sean Respert, the basketball player, was at Bishop Borges. Took the baseball job. Was the worst team in the country without even a little bit. We had the team for 2 years. I think we won 2 games. I was going to rebuild it. And then the athletic director at the time at Rochester decided, because I worked for the Oakland Press, said, would you like to come to work at Rochester High School? Sure. So I took the ski job at Rochester while I'm still officiating. And I wanted to get back into alpine ski racing because I had coached that all the time I was in California and when I grew up. So I went to Rochester to help out with the ski program. I took over a program that had 2 guys that coached that didn't know how to ski. So the point I'm making in that is there's sort of this pattern of opportunity where places where there shouldn't be, and taking jobs in situations where, how in that world did you get that opportunity?
Right.
So I took the ski job. They were just starting the lacrosse program at the time. Hank Lewandowski was the coach. So I got our ski program off the ground, helped a little bit with the lacrosse program. And then Tim Domke had taken over at the old West Bloomfield St. Mary's college basketball coach and West Bloomfield athletic director had taken over at Waterford and said, would you like to come over to Waterford and coach a ski team? So after 2 years at Rochester, I left and went to Waterford, started the ski program, and it turned out to be a United program. My son at that point was in the 2nd grade, so maybe there's an opportunity down the road to be able to coach a kid. Sure. And that's kind of how we ended up at Waterford. So I coached skiing and football, old sports that I had coached before. And halfway through my first winter at Waterford, Tim Domke says, by the way, you're going to be my new track coach. Excuse me? I've never been to a track meet. How in the world would I want to be a track coach? Well, we need somebody that just sort of can kind of got good assistant coaches. You're going to be the track coach. Okay. Took the track job. First year we won the league. Had 45 kids. We ended up with 50-some kids on the team. Well, having taken on a lacrosse job without knowing anything, track was no big deal. What the heck, give it a shot. When I went to the New York Times, I had no idea at the level that they were at. Worst you can do is fail. If nothing else in the world that I lived, failure was just a sort of a sidelight that just kind of comes with the territory. So we were fortunate enough the second year that I get a phone call that you're going to be the new lacrosse coach at Waterford, because Mr. Williston, who started the program, had some issues at a game at Heartland, and people shouldn't be arrested when lacrosse games are played. The stands that Waterford and Heartland had played got a little crazy. And they had really good track coaches at that point. And at the end of that second season of lacrosse, I get appointed to run the lacrosse program. Well, what little background I had, here you go. Here's 30 kids. Go to it. Chris Cooper, who everybody knows, is now a coach out on the East Coast. Chris was a part of that team. In our first year, we played Tecumseh in the state championship, or maybe it's semifinals. I don't remember which one, which introduced me to the MSLA and the 40 teams that were revolved around that, including Mike Costello, who was at Pontiac or at Plymouth. And that's kind of how we got started. So we started building a lacrosse program along with
Chris Cooper is, I mean, those of us in lacrosse, most of us know who he is, but isn't he coaching at a pretty high level now?
Yeah, he was an assistant at Princeton. I believe he's back at Binghamton. I'm not sure where he is, but Chris is the one kid who sort of beat the process of you don't have to be a Division I player to be a Division I coach. So he's been.
Yeah, he worked with Dwayne for a while, I think, right?
He was Michigan State assistant coach, and he did really well. Played his entire career was an MCLA career. Chris was a good, solid high school player, but that was some of the players we had, and so we had the ski team, and then they said, well, let's just make a united lacrosse team, which we did, and so we started kind of over, and next thing I know, we've got a lacrosse team. And what was interesting about the politics in those days was that there were 12 Division I teams. There were something like 6 or 7 Division II teams, no Division III, and then everybody else in Division IV. Being political, and at the time, Michigan Lacrosse Magazine came out. And I was asked to be the back page editor for Michigan Lacrosse Magazine. It was a suburban publication, which is a weekly set of newspapers in the Livonia, Birmingham area. So thinking about it one day, it seemed like we wanted to run an all-star game. And Rick de Blasio, who's now at East Grand Rapids and was still at East Grand Rapids in those points, said, well, you can't do that because you're not sanctioned. So Mike Costello kind of said, well, this is probably not a good idea. And I said, well, why not run one anyway? We don't have any representation on the board. This was probably 2001, 2000, somewhere in there. Let's have a game. And Mark Mealy was involved in the Grand Rapids area. Tony Quinn was at the time. So we got East-West against each other. We played at Waterford. We had this really cool game with 40 kids. We sold almost 700 tickets to the game. All the money went to charity. We got it locally televised on Comcast, on the local cable access station. We hired a couple guys that thought they knew. There were a couple of Detroit Turbo guys that we hired to do the play-by-play. And we got the all-star game, and more importantly, the all-state team entered into the Detroit Free Press because I was still working there part-time. Well, the powers to be from Rice and all of the folks that ran Division I, well, we were heretics because that's just don't do those things. Well, the reason they were mad is because they couldn't get their stuff published, and we did.
Now, so just as a point of reference, this is 2001 time
2001,
frame?
2002, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly the year.
So it's not our association at this point. It's still
the MSLA. We don't go to 2004, which is the first year that the MHSAA had taken over.
Okay.
So one of the conversations we had back to them was, we represent 80% of lacrosse being played in Michigan, and you have no representation on what essentially is the Michigan High School Lacrosse Coaches Association. None at all. Well, we'll give you one seat. And I argued pretty hard for representation, and when you're kind of dismissed, I'm not really good at being dismissed. So Wes Marble, the Tecumseh coach at the time, became our representative, but he kind of appointed himself. That next summer, things didn't necessarily go well for the group, and he was eventually taken out. And if I remember right, I think we had a conversation with Aaron Frank and Bob Dowd at that point. And I don't remember exactly who, but a number of other folks ended up on the board, and I think Mike Costello was one of them. And it's kind of where we met a lot of those guys that we now all know. And we stayed with the program at Waterford, and with the MHSAA came along, and we kind of went from there. And that's kind of where
it's interesting because, you I think you said, if I'm hearing you right, that tournament was an unsanctioned tournament. It's one that you did and crowned winners, right? State championship, but it was never anything endorsed by the MSLA at that point.
Well, the MSLA had its own championships as well as the Midwest.
Okay.
So there was a championship, but our all-star game, and it wasn't a championship, it was just an all-star game.
Okay, an all-star game.
They just didn't want to have, we weren't, and honest to God, and I joke Rick all the time, his direct line to me was, "You're not good enough. We don't want to put out things out in the sport that don't represent the way we play." And I thought that was a bit arrogant. And he doesn't remember this conversation. I do. And I think the guys that were on our end, Dave Moore was from Mattawan, who was part of that West team. We had this really good game. And guys like DJ Lubbs, who was a Michigan State coach, who's now at Florida Southern, those are the kind of guys that played in that game. I had some guys that went Division II, Division III. And I think Mike Costello would tell you that the players that came from the Plymouth group, which again was the 3 high schools in Plymouth, there was 4 or 5 guys that played in that game off of his team that were all, Division III, Division II. I don't know if there was any Division I players, but there were some really good players. And we had the game anyway. We had it in a kind of a swamp field at Waterford, but it came off. And I remember the idea that we get – you got to remember, I say to a local cable guy, I said, "Can you bring a camera out and film it and get it on the local cable?" They're just starved for, anything. So I said, "We'll hire the 2 announcers for you, and we'll plug them into cameras," the business that I'm now in. And we got a tape, and when every kid got a tape for that game. So it was one of those things. You're just trying to build something off the process. And at that point, we didn't.
Where does it go from there then? So you have that all-star game. Do you eventually get into the fold with the MSA, or do you have to wait?
No, West got onto the board the next year because I think we were kind of persistent. And then it just sort of exploded. We went from 35, 40 teams roughly to probably 60 or 70 teams, relatively short order. And I think just the sheer numbers, those guys recognized that we weren't going away. So when you start talking about Mike and me and Dave, and I mean, I'm missing some names. This is before Brian was I'm trying to think of the dentist that was at Clarkston at that time. There was a bunch of coaches, not anywhere near the ability of the coaches that were, the Rices and the better schools, the Eberts and those guys. But we were pretty strong and pretty vocal about and they let us in the door pretty quick. I don't know if we knocked it down as much as they opened it, but they recognized that the sport was going someplace. And then 2002, they were starting having conversations about whether or not we're going to go to the MHSAA. And we've chronicled those discussions about how, that became a sport through the state. And the funny part of that discussion is that I've got some interviews that we've done for the Hall of Fame, the same meeting, and 3 different guys talking about the same meeting, and there's 3 different representations in that meeting. Because, again, it's 20 years ago. So you get to 2004, the state takes over, and away you go. And that kind of takes it from that standpoint. And
well, that's always, to me, an interesting conversation piece, when we went from club to varsity. I mean, it's a discussion that is right now taking place, particularly with this shutdown that we're in with the COVID. That conversation is out there. Do you think it was a good thing? Or I guess that's not a very wise way.
I think it's a very fair question. Do I think it's a good thing? Yes, I do. Do I think it's a good thing on the way it happened? Well, that's another discussion. I'll use the 300-mile travel restriction as part of that discussion. When you take a sport over like the state did with us, we did get some things. Think about seeding. We did get a chance to seed. That's an important factor. It's now being looked at as something that may be used in other sports. Right. I think that the folks that were involved in the lacrosse world had lacrosse background. Very few had other sport backgrounds. And I think part of that experience is that the state makes rules for 28 sports, not for 2 sports, not for 1 sport. Everybody in every sport I've been involved in, I've been fortunate enough to win, I think, 4 or 5 OAA championships as a head coach in 4 to 5 different sports. I only say that as a reference point to that they know more about education than I do. So who am I to say something? And if you're making rules for 28 sports, is it fair that I can't go to New York? Probably. Does it make sense that it fits everybody? Yeah. And I think the downside of when we switched was they were the devil because they had rules in place that prohibited some of those teams who were used to having advantage. And the state's job responsibility was to even the playing field so that everybody had the same playing field and the same advantage. And if you're one of those if you're one of the haves, you're complaining. If you're a have-not, you're happy. And I think that was true in a lot of those sports that the state had taken on in those days. I think that's something that was really true.
Yeah, I think, all of this kind of occurs before I come in to sports at all from a coaching perspective. So, my experience is entirely within the realm of the MHSAA.
Right.
I think looking back to when I was a kid, and I wasn't one of these kids, but most of our great athletes from when I was in high school, the John Flynn's and the John Beckers and these guys from Saginaw, they played three sports. And,
Yep.
and the good athletes were all multi-sport athletes. I think the environment and landscape that we function in today, it's really rare to get a three-sport athlete anymore. It just isn't.
For probably 15 years, I coached 3 high school sports and a club lacrosse team. And I did that 12 months a year. And somebody said, well, that's nuts. Well, fortunately, I was the head coach in all cases. Fortunately enough, I set the schedule in all cases. And fortunately, other than not telling people, because when I would tell somebody, they looked like I was an idiot. How can you coach football in the fall? How can you coach skiing in the winter, high school lacrosse in the spring, and still have a college team? Well, I was at Eastern for 3. I was at Central for a year and a half, 2 years. And I was at Michigan State for 7 or 8 years. Now I'm back at Oakland. I'm still doing the same thing for 20 years. You know how many practices I've met? And understand, from driving from my house to East Lansing and back, it's a dumb thing to do, but I did that for 7 or 8 years. Never missed a practice. So the multiple process of being just a single athlete, you can make time. And I still had a full-time job. So somebody uses the excuse that you can't get things done because, well, there's just not enough time in the day. I'm sorry, that just doesn't hold water for me. And I think that's your point, is that in that beginning part, they wanted to restrict, which they did, but they didn't just restrict lacrosse. They restricted football. They restricted all kinds of things. And add to this one part of that puzzle, AAU basketball in the early 2000s is just getting off the ground the way we know it is now. 7-on-7 football was getting a hold of those kinds of things. Soccer was coming in play. All of those had an effect on lacrosse because those were sports that were going to run over everybody else. And if you're making rules for everybody, you got to take into consideration the profiteers that eventually we knew happened in lacrosse that certainly were happening in other sports. And the state's stuck. Do they do everything great? No. Do they do most things pretty well? That's an open discussion, but you got to have a rule book, and you're covering all the sports. It's part of the process. I think so your question of good or bad, I think I'm not going to question somebody in the state about 300 miles because they're smarter than I am about education.
Yeah. No, it's good points, I think. So let's talk a little bit about your coaching career. I mean, in high school, you've coached, because I'd like to take some time and talk a little bit about the differences between high school athletes and college athletes, and the difference between girls and boys when you're coaching, because you've got some experience as the Michigan State women's coach, which I think, for me and my experience with you, kind of transformed the way that you coached.
I don't think there's any question about it. From Waterford, I'll just give you the chronology pretty quick. From Waterford, I went to St. Mary's. In 2007, my son graduated. He'd been a very successful high school ski racer. Was all state in lacrosse. Was a decent athlete. Oakland Press did a story about father and son leaving the sport. The end of the column, they asked my son if I was through, and his line was, "No, there's still quite a bit of fire in the belly." Paul Mhslca was let go at St. Mary's, and George Port called and said, "Would you consider having a conversation?" Well, sure. So I went over. First 9 games at St. Mary's, I was 0-9 and getting blistered, and I decided that maybe it was a time to just do what I do. It was a hallmark point in my career from the aspect I'm just going to do what I do. Changed around a few things, did the things I wanted to do, and we won our last 11 out of 12. Got beat in the state in the regional finals. Had a really good athletic team, and what I really learned at that point was I had really good athletes. As we started to win the first year, all of a sudden I started to become a better coach based on the opinions of other people. It was interesting because I was the same coach. I made the decision my last year at Waterford to start going to Notre Dame camps, going to Ohio State camps, going to Rutgers. Don Gay had taken me along at one point to a Rutgers camp, and started to hang out with the college guys. because I didn't know the sport. John Kinney was nice enough a couple times to sort of, I knew what I knew, but man, all of a sudden you get to St. Mary's where there's some legitimate players, and I needed to learn and try to improve my process. And I'd done that and everything else. Officials, you go to sport, you go to the Big Ten camp in the summertime to learn So now you're having conversations. Again, our sport is fortunate that I couldn't go have a conversation with Mark D'Antonio or with Jim Harbaugh, the same conversation I can have with Nick Myers or Kevin Corrigan, just a different level.
It really is.
So you go to camp, you start to learn. Bill Wolford, probably one of the best coaches in the world. Bill's brother Teddy was at Upper Arlington. Bill was my first roommate at Notre Dame. We became friends. Bill has coached the Ohio Machine for a bunch of years. He grew up. His sister is the executive director for the executive assistant for Ohio State's president, and has been done that for 30 years. All of a sudden, you got insides and opportunities as you have these conversations. Anyway, so you go to St. Mary's. So the second year, I didn't get to be a better coach. I just got out of the way. And I got out of the way and let them play. And we went to the state finals. We did a loss.
And I think that's the year we first met. I think we played that year.
So at the end of my first year, Jeff Docking, who's now the president has been a long-term president at Adrian, they were shopping. They wanted their son to go to a private school. So we sat down and had a conversation with us. We were the last school they visited, and he asked me a question. He says, "Well, where do you think you are as a lacrosse team?" And I said, "I think we're coming. We're pretty good. What do you think you're coaching?" I said, "Well, I'm the dumbest coach in the Catholic League." And it was an absolutely true statement. You had Dave Wilson, you had Chris Ferrari, you had Rob Ambrose, and you had me.
John Leary was there too, right?
Well, yeah, and John, and he was at UAD. I was the dumbest coach in the league. Didn't take brains to figure it out. The point to it was, if you come to St. Mary's for lacrosse, then you got a problem. And I know that St. Mary's says it's family and all the rest of it. Sometimes sports become first at private schools, but you come to St. Mary's for the private school aspect. And being a K-8 Catholic school kid, I had some understanding. What was interesting about St. Mary's is that I got unbelievably ridiculed for handing out scholarships, $25,000 scholarships to my players. And all the years that Waterford lost players to St. Mary's and Catholic schools, I never said a word. When I went to St. Mary's, all of a sudden I'm this unbelievable recruiter, unbelievable coach. No, I just had better athletes. I had Kalen Lucas. I had Deion Sims. I had Ian Brahms. I had some pretty good athletes and kids who'd won state championships in other sports. So when he came, we got to the state final the second year, and we did that because we had good players. Am I a good coach, or am I just got good players? Well, I think it's a combination of those things, but it's the old column. It's the old column idea that I was never as smart as I thought I was, and I was never as dumb as I was. My audience, I'm who I am. I can coach. We did a couple things, and I'll be brief, but we had a kid. We ran a 1-4-1, and we had a kid inside who couldn't catch the ball. I moved him up to the top of the box. I moved my upper midi out towards the alley, and we played what I call now a 1-4 spread. We didn't do it because it was innovative. We did it because the kid couldn't catch the ball. And all of a sudden, we started scoring like in droves. I mean, look back to the 2009 championship game. We were up 9-1 at one point. They didn't know what to do with the kid standing up top because you had to figure out what to do with your defensive guys. Well, wow, that works. And that became the staple offense for us and me. I still run the same offense. We've added to it.
I really remember the Brahms kid. He went to, I want to say,
went to West Point.
West Point, yeah.
Went to West Point. Well, it's Ian was a perfect example, but in vision, I want to tell one Ian Brahms story. We were supposed to be in the finals in 2010 against what was then either Forest Hill Central, who we'd beaten that season, and then we also beat East Grand Rapids that year. We were the team to beat in Division II. The second to last high school game, the two best players I had on the team, my number one and number two scorers, both went down for temporary, knee in one and an ankle in another, Ian being one of them, and I forget Schubach, Drew Schubach, who went to UAD, Division I kid. They both went down. We had played De La Salle during the season, beat them 19-1. We get them in the regional final. I'm playing without my best two players. and I had one more defenseman that had gone down with a bad injury. So we played the regional final, I believe, on a Thursday or Wednesday. Well, anyway, Saturday or Sunday, Ian had to go to Chicago to have his West Point induction physical. He was concerned that if he gets hurt in the regional final, he doesn't get his scholarship because he's got to pass the physical to get into West Point. So I don't play him. It's 6-3 or 6-4 at the half. We eventually lose, I think, by 1 or 2. And I'd lost the year before in the finals when the kid from, I can't remember the kid's name from East Grand Rapids, who was Mr. Lacrosse 2 years in a row, and decided he was going to score a bunch of goals. Now I lose.
Denning, I think.
Yeah, it was Clendenning. Clendenning.
Yeah.
He went to Hillsdale and became a Division II high school or a college All-American. So Ian doesn't play. We lose in the regional final. Well, see, he's not a very good coach. He doesn't have a clue what's going on. We had a bad game, but we also lost. Our best defensemen, our best 2 scorers didn't play. And they had gotten back their goaltender. They had gotten back a couple players. There's like 4 people in the world know that I kept him out so we wouldn't have a problem with his physical for West Point. I'm telling the story for the first time because other than him and his mom, nobody else knows. And it doesn't matter. But got vilified because, well, they have no clue. When I see Ian now, which is not a lot, but I see him, he's now a Ranger. He's a captain in the U.S. Army. And I get a hug because those are the things that matters. Those are the things that never get told. And eventually you go where you go. So I had a really good run at St. Mary's, and then it was really fun. And through some other things that happened, I had to move on, and that was the way that works.
And from there, you go to Oxford?
Well, the last year at St. Mary's, I took to Michigan State. While I was at St. Mary's, I coached in the Mhslca. I was at Eastern for 3 years, and I was at Central for a couple. And then I got a call from Michigan State asking me if I would come to state to be the girls' coach. One of these opportunities that opens up when you have no idea what you're doing. I had track background. What am I going to do? Worst I'm going to do is fail. I mean, that's not a problem. Explaining to athletic administration at Michigan State that even though I've raised a lot of money for the university as an alumni, I've never seen a girls lacrosse game before. So I'm not sure you want me here as the coach. They needed some direction. Went up, and you were pointing out earlier about the metamorphosis. I think having never had a sister nor daughter, and now I'm in charge of 30 girls. I thought I knew all there was to know about lacrosse, and certainly I knew how to coach. I was an expert. It took me about 3 hours to recognize that I'm way over my head. And that first year, my cousin coached at Brighton for a long time. In fact, my niece was Miss Softball at Brighton, Jill DeRoche, in 2000, I think 4 or 5. So I'd call her, and I'd go, oh, my God, I have no idea what I'm doing. I said, never had a sister, never had a daughter. I'm going to lose my mind the first year. Somebody told me that coaches, females, women, young women a lot, says just surrender. You just surrender and just coach the team, and you'll have fun. It was the best thing that ever happened to me as a coach because I realized I had to listen better. I knew what I knew, but I didn't understand the process. And once I figured out that it was going to make me a better coach, I became the protective dad kind of guy over my young ladies. Was there a long time, became president of the league. My offense, which worked pretty well on the men's side, ended up working pretty good on the women's side. And we ended up, I think, leading the country in scoring for the last 5 years I was there. We put up a lot of points. And it was a really good experience. I went to state, and I couldn't stay at St. Mary's because George didn't want me. George Port, the athletic director, didn't want me dividing my time between state. And I probably went a little bit overboard when I went to state because, as a club coach, sometimes you get the idea that you're actually coaching college. You're coaching a club team their kids pay. And I think you have to look at that. State was a bigger deal because it was Michigan State. And it was my alma mater, and it was just – and I was very proud. And it was between St. Mary's and Michigan State, it was the best coaching opportunities. Let me just back up. My first year at state, after leaving St. Mary's, I wanted to still coach boys. There were some good jobs open, and I took the worst job in the state, which was Oxford. They were 5-80 at the time. And so what the heck, it's nice close to home. Driving to East Lansing, this makes it easier. So I took the job at Oxford. The joke about Oxford was they were in a 27-game 2-year losing streak. when I took the team over. They had, I think, 20 kids. My son took them the first year before the season started. I announced on Sunday night before the season started that we would win 10 games, to which everybody said, yeah, right. You're an idiot. And we won 12. And it was just one of those, we were just better than the other meat squad teams. It wasn't that we were that much better. And then proceeded to build a program, which eventually became, I think, a pretty strong program. The year before I left, we ended up getting beaten overtime in the regional final by Midland. We lost to them by a goal, who turned around and lost to Heartland by a goal. So I thought we did a pretty good job of getting us to that point of building a program. And we had, I don't know, 75, 80, 100 kids in our middle school program.
And on and played at the next level as well. I mean, the one I know obviously is Noah, but there were some other kids from that team that went on, I believe.
Yeah, we had a number of kids that played at Michigan State and played at other club teams and played at various – I think we had, I don't know, I want to say about 10 or 12 kids that played different places. I know Noah played with some of your kids that were from Brighton. I just know that Matt Johnson was just inducted into the CHSL Hall of Fame, which is a terrific opportunity.
Yeah, good for him. He's a great kid.
So if you look at all of that, and it was a really fun experience there, and it was just kind of like, okay, state finished, and Oxford was maybe kind of time to be done. And then the last thing is I was going, well, I'm going to retire. I'm going to go sail on the boat and do the rest of it. I'll be 66 in a couple of weeks. Last year, I don't know, January, decided to make the trick back into it. Well, got to find me a program nobody cares about, because that's just been the way we operate. Went to Ann Arbor Skyline, interviewed. They had been, I think they'd won 5 or 6 games in the previous 3 years. Jack Robineau, who had been the coach there, who had left for Denver, who's actually now back on our staff at Skyline, and this is the background here that you see of our field. Jack came back this year, would have been our defensive coordinator. I went down to Saline to watch them play on a Sunday night in one of the summer leagues or one of the fall leagues. I don't remember exactly what it was. And how could this team be 200? Holy crap. These guys are some players. So we took it over last year, winning 15, losing 5, lost 3 times to the same team, and started over. And last year was fun because you take all of that experience from all of those other places and you just go coach. And we're not Brother Rice. I think this year we would have been a pretty good team. I think we'll build a program there. And Ron Ebert, in interviewing Ron for this series, I'll say the same thing I said then, which is Ron looked at the camera at the last part of it and kind of said, I'm not through this yet. I'm a little older than you. I'm not sure when I'm going to retire, but it's the smile that you see coming back is why we keep doing what we do. And I think that's the important part. So it's been a really fun career. I've been fortunate enough to coach a number of sports, to get that experience. We played a bunch of sports. We could spend 2 hours talking about parents and talking about all those kinds of things, but we approach it in a way that makes sense and kind of move forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, I look at all of the things that we experience as coaches now and all of the complaints and the good things that we have going on. It's really not all that different than when you began your career. I just think it's, you know, I'm not sure if the sport has changed or athletics has changed, or we've just changed and grown and matured, or if it's just a combination of all of that.
Well,
that's kind of how I view it.
I think a lot of it is, I'll use semantics. As a writer, I use different words than other people use. And I'll give you a small example. I tell kids to be selfish as players. They look at you like you're nuts. I said, selfish is being the best player you can be. Selfish isn't going into 2 guys and losing the ball. That's just stupid. So if this kid becomes the most selfish player he can be to be the best player, make the right pass, it's not any different a word, but I got their attention. When I tell them that it's okay to miss practice if they have something that's important for them. If their girlfriend's in town, they want to take a day off, and they're telling me the truth, the only rule we have is don't lie. If the kid wants to take a day off from my practice, I understand this is not mainstream thought, but if a kid wants to take a day off from my practice to go do something that's important to him, in the 35 years I've coached, I've lost maybe 6 practice days out of 6 kids. But they know that I know that it's important for them because they have no control over their own lives. Which brings me to the last one. Don't tell me what you want me to hear. Tell me what you think. Well, the argument is sometimes kids look like they're a little bit sassy or they can be a little bit rude. Well, I can't ask them to talk and then tell them to shut up when I don't like what they say. And a kid that's 17 or 18 years old, I don't want to say kid, young adult, they're hounded by their parents. They're hounded by school to become Harvard leadership All-Americans. And they have very little time. What's different in what was and what is that the expectation is just nuts. And if they don't have some places to be an outlet, my practices are an hour and 30 minutes long. And that includes a 15-minute warm-up where everybody gets to have a conversation. They said, well, you can't be effective being that kind of, having no short practices. We've done okay. We've won 100 games in the last 10, 12 years. I mean, we've won a bunch of games. And my point to it is that if lacrosse is the most important thing in your life, you better get a new life. Because that's just a staple. And that says, well, it's not, you're not buying 100% in. In ski racing, we used to take days off at the end of the season so kids don't get burnt out. I've never been a place where the program didn't get bigger. And every time I've left, the programs got smaller. So I'll say that some of my thought process of different semantics and different approaches, and then the final line is, it's nothing against parents. You want to come down to my practice and stand there? Cool. Now, we did a couple things that are different. I kicked parents out of my middle school practice at Oxford, so they couldn't be there, so the kids could just go practice. There shouldn't be more parents at a practice than kids. And the second thing is that my middle school teams were coached by high school kids because parents and dads don't know the sport of lacrosse. They can have opinion about baseball, football, maybe even hockey and basketball. But how many of them play lacrosse?
Right.
So it's a unique process. I think our middle school programs have done pretty well in that process. We got involved in Suburban League. I was part of that as that grew. I'm a part of this organization. And I think the only thing that I've really said that's probably dictatorial is when I talk to parents, I will talk all day about whatever you want to think. But I'm 60 and I've been along a long time and you haven't been. And we're not going to have a conversation about who plays and when. But the rest of it's open. If you want to come support the game, that's cool. If you don't like it, there's the door. And that's not to be a pain in the ass. I'm just not going to get into discussion with a parent about playing time. And it's not negotiable. And that's because probably I am old school. I don't think that's old school. I think it's just the way things are. And I think that's the difference. But you want your kids to have fun. You want your kids to understand the process. And you want them, and I would say this, I would say that our kids get it when they're 25 more than they get it when they're 20. And if I've done that, I can't tell you how many kids are still coaching because the programs have been in our program, both skiing and hockey, and for that matter, for lacrosse.
All right.
I don't think you approach things much
You've had a coaching career in Michigan high school lacrosse that has spanned, including this year, 23 or 24 years.
Yeah.
Favorite memory, favorite time? Don't
2000,
forget every team.
Yeah, one specific one. 2009 state championship, but for a completely different reason. We played the first game, and it went a little bit long for TV. And our kids were devastated when the kids scored the goal, and we lost because we'd banged it. We hit the crossbar on our first possession. TV had another start. I wanted our kids spontaneously went over to shake the hands of the kids from East Grand Rapids. And Tom was worried about the TV time, wanted to get through the preliminary stuff and the post-game stuff so that they could get on with the Rice CC game. And I kind of was a pain in the ass. I said, I'm not moving until these kids shake everybody's hand. If that's a problem for upstairs, then you guys can go to a commercial. But the idea that we would go to them to shake hands before our kids came to me, before our kids came to each other in a sign of sportsmanship was something I'll always remember. And it was important because we only got to the state finals because I apparently gave out scholarships. And because we must have cheated because I wasn't a good enough coach to get that team to the finals. And then we acted like citizens. And even Tom came up afterwards and said, I really appreciate you kind of being a pain in the ass and barking back at me because those kids should have had that opportunity to shake hands. It had nothing to do with lacrosse. And I think that's part of that. And I think the other thing, the larger thing for me is that because of my insecurity about who I am as a person sometimes, you overthink things way too much. doing this series, when you're outspoken and you have an opinion, you're always not sure where you stand in the world of opportunity, in this case, lacrosse. And having done this series of conversations, people that I thought I had relationships with or didn't think I had relationships with or bad blood with, turned out that a lot of it was just miscommunication. And to have the acceptance, I'm not even sure that's the right word. I'm not sure I never had their acceptance, but to be able to see that the thread that goes through all of the things that we do matters to that group that you're involved with, you in Brighton, me in Ann Arbor, wherever it was before we came here. And to have those insecurities put to rest because they were just self-inflicted has been really terrific, because maybe you were respected. Maybe you were thought of in a different light than you thought yourself. And you think, well, all the experience you have, that's something that comes with the territory. It should just be what it is. No, I think everybody that coaches is insecure. I also think they're egomaniacs to some extent, because you can't take a large group of people any place that they don't want to go if you don't have the backbone to take them there. And sometimes you doubt yourself. For me, having taken over programs that nobody wanted, or taking over programs where I had no background, is a complete formula for failure. So you don't mind change eventually, because you start to dig yourself out of those things. And let me tell you something, I've dug out of a lot of programs that nobody wanted and done pretty well with them. And that gives you the security, but then sometimes you want validation. And this series has been able to give me validation personally, because I realize everybody's in the same boat. They all love their kids. They all want the same. And in recent times, I've had some conversations with some club coaches that I'm not real fond with, and we found some common ground. And if we communicate, if that's all we do is communicate, we do as an old group a poor job of getting the younger guys into our group. And that's something that we have to focus on. And you and I have had this conversation. We got to do a better job of bringing them along, because nobody cares what happened in 1950. They care what happens now. And how do I facilitate that? And think of it this way. You're the dad. You always got to be the bigger guy. I'm the old guy. So are you. We got to be the bigger players to bring the bottom up and respect their opinions and their thoughts and their ideas. And sometimes I think that gets, as the movie says, lost in translation.
Well, it'd be tough to do this for as long as you've done it, for as well as you've done it. Forget about the fact that you have, I believe, 194 wins cumulative, which, this season you could have had a chance to get into that 200 club. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you say that all of the coaches at any age or any level, the good ones are all in it for the kids. And we all come to that from a different perspective. But in the end, what we're doing is serving kids and trying to teach lessons that we've learned through a vehicle that we all love. So, I just want to say thank you for the time in the interview today. I think it's a great addition to the catalog of conversations that you've had. And I want to, just encourage you to continue to do these, because I think they, in the long term, are going to add value to that. And ultimately, what we all we need are good coaches to have good players, and we need good refs. And I think building this level of communication in the community is incredibly helpful, and we're all grateful.
I appreciate the kind words, and I will leave you with this, and that is this thread that I keep talking about that is so important, is that we are more similar, and you've heard the old corny statements, we're more similar than not. If in this post in this chair I sit, where I am talking with these different people, I have had this same conversation with everybody, and it's the unique position of being able to communicate that process. And I honestly believe that this vehicle we call these conversations is being watched more and more and being talked about more and more, because it does have the value of, oh, maybe we do have more in common. But sometimes in our world, we don't get enough time frame to be able to take the second out to realize that. And if all I'm doing is waving to say, hey, take that extra 5 seconds, and oh, by the way, old guys, take the 10 seconds extra to make sure you reach down and grab somebody and bring those guys along with understanding why it's so important. And it's about the story, it's about the camaraderie and all the rest of it. But we've worked so hard. We want the same success for them that we've had the opportunity to, enjoy. And as long as the heart is there and the body's there, I get why Paterno coached for as long as he did. But Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And this has been a really fun conversation.
All right. Well, thanks again. Stay safe.
Okay. Jim, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.